I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine grinding outside my house at 5:30 in the morning, and I already knew what I would find when I looked out the window. Sure enough, the HOA's snow plow had dumped another massive wall of packed snow directly across my garage door, making it impossible for me to get my truck out without at least 40 minutes of back-breaking shoveling. This was the fourth time in 2 weeks, and my patience had officially run out. I lived in Breckenridge Estates, a planned community just outside Boulder, Colorado, where the Homeowners Association controlled everything from mailbox colors to the exact height your grass could grow. When I bought my house 3 years ago, I thought the HOA fees would be worth it for the amenities and snow removal services. What I did not realize was that the HOA president, a middle-aged woman named Barbara Henderson, ran the neighborhood like her personal fiefdom and had a particular vendetta against anyone who dared question her authority. My name is Jake Novak, and I am a 34-year-old software engineer who works from home most days but still needs to leave my house occasionally. The snow blocking issue started in early December when the first big storm hit. I noticed the plow driver seemed to take special care to push extra snow right in front of my garage, but I figured it was just bad luck. By the third time, I realized it was deliberate. I had made the mistake 2 months earlier of filing a complaint about Barbara's son parking his motorcycle on the common area grass all summer, killing a large patch of lawn that everyone else had to look at. The complaint was valid, backed up by photos and specific HOA covenant violations, but Barbara did not appreciate having her family called out. She dismissed my complaint at the next board meeting, claiming there was insufficient evidence despite the dozen photos I had submitted. 3 other homeowners had backed me up, but Barbara controlled the board with an iron fist, and the other members were too intimidated to challenge her. Now, standing in my driveway in my bathrobe and boots, staring at the wall of snow blocking my garage, I understood this was retaliation. The plow driver was Pete something, a contractor Barbara's brother-in-law hired, and he clearly had instructions to make my life difficult. The snow pile was not just a little spillover. It was a deliberate, chest-high wall of packed ice and snow that extended at least 8 feet in front of my garage door. I pulled out my phone and took photos from multiple angles, making sure to capture the time stamp and the fact that every other house on the street had clear driveways. My neighbor to the left, an elderly man named Frank, caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic shrug from his window. He had told me weeks ago to just keep my head down and deal with Barbara's petness, but I was not wired that way. After getting dressed in proper winter gear, I spent the next hour and 15 minutes shoveling. My back screamed in protest, and my hands were numb despite the insulated gloves. I had to be on a video call at 9, and it was already past 7:30 by the time I finished. I was going to be late getting my morning work done, all because of Barbara's vindictive nonsense. That evening, I drafted a formal complaint email to the HOA board, complete with photos, timestamps, and a detailed explanation of how the snow removal service was being weaponized against me. I pointed out that I paid the same HOA fees as everyone else and deserved the same level of service. I kept the tone professional and stuck to the facts, though what I really wanted to write would have required significantly more profanity. Barbara responded within an hour, which was unusual since she typically ignored complaints for days. Her email was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. She claimed the plow driver was doing his best under difficult conditions, that snow had to go somewhere, and that my garage happened to be in an unfortunate location where snow naturally accumulated. She suggested I consider shoveling more promptly in the morning to avoid any inconvenience. The location excuse was absurd. My house sat on a straight section of road with no particular geographic features that would cause snow to naturally accumulate in front of my garage more than anyone else's. It was a flat suburban street that could not be more standard if it tried. I replied, keeping my response brief and requesting that the issue be added to the agenda for the next board meeting. Barbara responded that the meeting agenda was already full, but she would consider it for the following month. That meeting was 6 weeks away. The next morning, the plow came through again at 5:30. Once again, a massive wall of snow blocked my garage. I photographed it, added it to my growing file of evidence, and spent another hour shoveling. My software development work was suffering because I was starting each day exhausted and frustrated. By the end of that week, it had happened 7 times. Every single morning after a snow event, which in Colorado in December and January was nearly every morning, the plow specifically targeted my driveway. I started setting my alarm for 5:15 to watch out the window, and I saw it happen with my own eyes. The plow would come down the street, pushing snow to the sides in neat, manageable amounts for each house, and then when it reached my property, the driver would angle the blade to dump maximum snow directly in front of my garage. I decided to try a different approach. On Saturday morning, I drove to the address listed for Henderson Property Management, the company Barbara's brother-in-law owned and that held the snow removal contract. It was in an industrial park in Thornton, about 40 minutes from my house. The office was closed on weekends, but I left a detailed letter explaining the situation and requesting a meeting. No one ever responded. Meanwhile, the snow blocking continued. I started keeping a log with photos and exact measurements. The snow wall in front of my garage averaged 6 feet wide and 4 feet high after each plowing. My neighbor Frank had maybe 6 inches of spillover. The neighbor on my right, a young couple with a baby, had even less. I filed another complaint with the HOA, this time including a spreadsheet showing the disparity. Barbara responded that I was being paranoid and wasting the board's time with frivolous complaints. That was when I decided to fight back. I spent an evening researching the HOA covenants, county ordinances, and Colorado state law regarding homeowners associations. I discovered something interesting. There was a service road that ran along the back of the development, providing access to the HOA's maintenance shed, the community mailbox kiosk, and a small equipment storage area where they kept landscaping tools and the backup generator for the neighborhood entrance sign. This access road was HOA common property, but it was also the only way to reach those facilities. According to the covenants, the HOA had to maintain access to these common areas for the benefit of all residents. However, there was nothing in the covenants that prevented residents from temporarily using the access road for parking, provided they did not block access for an unreasonable length of time. More importantly, the road was not technically part of the public street system. It was private property belonging to the HOA, which meant regular parking regulations did not apply in the same way. The county had no jurisdiction over it. I formed a plan. The following Tuesday, after the plow blocked my garage for the 15th time that season, I did my usual shoveling routine. But that evening, after the sun went down and I had finished my workday, I drove my truck around to the access road and parked it directly across the narrow lane, completely blocking access to the maintenance facilities. My truck was a full-size Ford F-250, and the access road was only about 12 feet wide. When I parked perpendicular to the road, my truck completely blocked it. Nothing could get past. I made sure I was not blocking any fire access or emergency routes. I checked and double-checked the county maps. The access road was purely for HOA maintenance convenience, not safety infrastructure. Then I went home and waited. My phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. It was Barbara, and she was livid. "You need to move your truck immediately," she said without any greeting. Her voice was shaking with rage. "Good morning, Barbara," I said calmly. "What seems to be the problem? Your truck is blocking the access road. Pete needs to get to the equipment shed to service the plow." "I am parked on HOA common property, which I have every right to use as a paying member of this association," I said. "I checked the covenants very carefully. There is nothing prohibiting residents from using that road." "You are blocking access," she repeated. "Just temporarily," I said. "I will move it when I have time. I have been quite busy lately, spending an hour or more every morning shoveling the massive amounts of snow that mysteriously keep appearing in front of my garage. You understand how these things can pile up and leave you with no time for other tasks." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "This is harassment," Barbara finally said. "I would never harass anyone," I replied. "I am simply parking on common property that I have every right to access. However, I would be happy to discuss a resolution to both of our problems at your earliest convenience." She hung up on me. 20 minutes later, I received an email from Barbara stating that my truck was in violation of HOA rules and demanding I move it within 2 hours or face fines. I responded by quoting the specific sections of the covenants that permitted my parking and requesting she provide the specific rule I was violating. She could not, because there was not one. I left my truck parked there all day. According to Frank, who called me around noon to give me updates, Barbara had driven by the access road 3 times, each time getting out of her car to stare at my truck in fury. Pete, the plow driver, had apparently shown up and had a heated conversation with her, gesturing angrily at my truck. That afternoon, I received a notice that an emergency HOA board meeting had been called for that evening to address my parking violation. I replied that I would attend and looked forward to discussing all outstanding issues. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse at 7. When I arrived, all 5 board members were present. Barbara as president, a timid man named Gary as vice president, a woman named Susan as treasurer, another woman named Patricia as secretary, and a younger guy named Mike as member at large. About a dozen other residents had also shown up, word having spread that something interesting was happening. Barbara called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a tirade about my truck blocking essential HOA infrastructure. She claimed I was endangering the community by preventing access to critical equipment. I waited until she finished, then calmly responded. "I am happy to move my truck," I said. Right after we resolved the issue of the snow plow deliberately blocking my garage every single morning for the past month. "That is not what this meeting is about," Barbara snapped. "Then I guess my truck stays where it is," I said with a shrug. Gary, the vice president, cleared his throat nervously. "Maybe we should discuss both issues." Barbara shot him a look that could have melted the snow outside, but several other residents murmured in agreement. Frank spoke up from the back. "I have seen what they are doing to Jake's driveway," he said. "It is not right. The plow dumps way more snow on his property than anyone else's." Another resident, a woman named Carol, agreed. "I noticed that too. I thought it was strange." Barbara's face was turning red. "The plow driver is doing his job. Where the snow ends up is not something we can micromanage." "I have photos," I said, pulling out my phone. "Would the board like to see the evidence?" I have more than 40 documented instances showing the deliberate targeting of my property. I passed my phone to Gary, who looked through the photos with increasing concern. He showed them to Susan, who frowned and passed them to Patricia. Even Mike leaned over to look, his expression growing uncomfortable. "These do look pretty bad," Gary admitted. "This is ridiculous," Barbara said. "We are not going to waste time on this." "Actually, I think we should," Susan said quietly. It was the first time I had heard her contradict Barbara in the 2 years I had been attending meetings. If a contractor is not providing equal service to all residents, that is a real problem. Barbara looked like she might explode, but she was losing control of the room. "Fine," she bit out. "I will speak to Pete about being more careful. Now move your truck." "I appreciate that," I said. "But given that this problem has persisted for over a month despite my repeated complaints, I need some assurance that it will actually be resolved. I propose the following. I will move my truck when I have seen 5 consecutive snow removal events where my driveway is left in the same condition as my neighbors. If the targeting continues, my truck goes back across the access road." "You cannot hold HOA property hostage," Barbara said. "I am not holding anything hostage. I am parking on common property that I have a right to use. If you would like to amend the covenants to restrict parking on the access road, you are welcome to propose that change and put it to a vote of the full membership. Until then, I am not violating any rules." Gary looked at Barbara. "He is technically correct. There is nothing in the covenants about that road." Barbara looked like she wanted to strangle him. The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with various residents taking sides. Some thought I was being unreasonable and should just move my truck. Others, particularly those who had their own issues with Barbara's management style, enjoyed seeing her backed into a corner. Eventually, Gary proposed that they would instruct Pete to take extra care with my driveway, and I agreed to move my truck as a show of good faith, with the understanding that it would return to the access road if the problem continued. I moved my truck that night, but I parked it on the street right in front of my house where I could watch it. The next morning, it snowed 3 inches overnight. I watched from my window as the plow came through at 5:45. When it reached my house, the driver pushed the snow evenly to the side, just like he did for everyone else. My driveway had the same light coating of snow as my neighbor's. Victory, or so I thought. The reprieve lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th day after the board meeting, the plow came through and dumped a massive pile right back in front of my garage. It was almost worse than before, like Pete was making up for the few days of restraint. I took my photos, sent a brief email to the board documenting the violation, and that evening I parked my truck back across the access road. This time, I left it there. Barbara called within an hour, screaming into the phone that I was in breach of our agreement. I calmly explained that they had breached first by allowing the targeting to continue, and that I would be leaving my truck parked exactly where it was until the snow season ended, or until they found a new plow contractor who could treat all residents equally. "You cannot do this," she shouted. "Watch me," I said, and hung up. The next morning, I found a bright orange notice stuck to my front door threatening immediate legal action and daily fines of $200 for my violation of HOA rules. I photographed the notice, drafted a response citing the specific covenant sections that permitted my parking, and emailed it to the entire board with a request that they table any fine discussions until they could identify the actual rule I was breaking. I also took the precaution of consulting with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Jennifer Lawson, and she had an office in Boulder. I showed her all my documentation, the photos of the snow targeting, The emails with Barbara, the HOA covenants, and the notices threatening fines. Jennifer listened to everything, reviewed the documents, and smiled. "They do not have a leg to stand on," she said. "You are clearly within your rights to park on common property, and you have extensive documentation of the snow removal discrimination. If they try to fine you, we can fight it easily. In fact, if you want, we could go on the offensive and sue them for breach of contract and harassment." "I just want them to plow my driveway fairly," I said. "I understand, but you should know you have options," Jennifer said. "In the meantime, I will draft a formal letter to the board explaining your legal position and advising them against any retaliatory action. That should make them think twice." Jennifer sent the letter the next day. It was a beautiful piece of legal writing that politely but firmly explained that I was breaking no rules, that the HOA was in breach of its own service obligations, and that any fines or legal action against me would be met with immediate countersuits for harassment, breach of contract, and discrimination. Barbara did not take it well. An email went out to the entire neighborhood that evening, written by Barbara and sent from the official HOA account, claiming that I was selfishly blocking access to critical maintenance infrastructure and endangering the community. The email painted me as an unreasonable troublemaker who was punishing all residents because of a minor personal grievance. The email backfired spectacularly. Within an hour, my own email inbox was full of messages from neighbors. Some were supportive, saying they had seen the snow discrimination and backed my position. Others were curious about what was really going on, since Barbara's email was clearly one-sided. A few were critical, but they were in the minority. Frank forwarded me an email chain that was circulating among some of the longer-term residents, discussing Barbara's management style and this incident as the latest example of her vindictive behavior. Apparently, I was not the first person she had targeted. There was a running list of residents who had crossed her over the years and subsequently experienced mysterious problems with HOA services, selective enforcement of petty rules, or harassment via official notices. One resident, a man named Tom who lived on the other side of the development, called me directly. "I just want you to know I support what you are doing," he said. "Barbara tried to fine me $5,000 2 years ago because she claimed my fence was 6 inches too tall. I had to hire a surveyor to prove she was wrong, cost me $1,500. She has been running this place like a dictatorship." "I appreciate that," I said. "I am just trying to get fair treatment." "Well, you have got more guts than most of us," Tom said. "Let me know if you need anything." As January turned into February, my truck remained parked across the access road. Every morning, the plow would come through and block my garage. Every morning, I would shovel for an hour while my truck sat immovable on the access road, preventing Pete from servicing his equipment or accessing the storage shed. According to Frank, who kept me updated on the neighborhood gossip, Pete was furious. He had to park his plow on the street and walk back to his equipment, which added time and inconvenience to his day. He complained to Barbara repeatedly, but she had painted herself into a corner. She could not order me to move my truck without addressing the snow discrimination, and she refused to do that because it would mean admitting she had been retaliating against me. The standoff continued through February. Colorado had a particularly heavy snow year, and we got storms every few days. Each time, the same routine played out. Plow comes through, blocks my garage, I shovel. My truck stays parked across the access road. Barbara tried various tactics to force me to move. She sent more threatening letters, all of which Jennifer replied to with increasingly firm legal language. She called an emergency board meeting to vote on new parking restrictions for the access road, but the motion failed because Gary, Susan, and Mike all voted against it, apparently tired of being Barbara's rubber stamp. Patricia voted with Barbara, but 2 against 3 meant the motion died. That board meeting was apparently quite dramatic. According to Susan, who called me afterward, Barbara had screamed at the other board members for betraying her and threatened to resign. Gary had calmly responded that maybe that would be for the best, which sent Barbara into an even bigger rage. In early March, Barbara tried a different approach. She hired a towing company to remove my truck from the access road. I was at my computer working when Frank called to warn me that a tow truck was hooking up to my vehicle. I immediately called Jennifer, who instructed me to go out there and inform the tow truck driver that he was about to participate in an illegal towing action. I jogged around to the access road and found a guy in coveralls connecting chains to my truck. "Excuse me," I said. "What are you doing?" "HOA called," he said. "Said this truck is abandoned and blocking their access." "This truck is not abandoned. I am the owner and I am standing right here. I am parked legally on HOA common property. If you tow this vehicle without my permission, that is theft, and I will have you arrested and sue your company." The driver hesitated. Looking uncertain, I pulled out my phone. "I have a lawyer on speed dial and I will call the sheriff's department right now if you do not unhook my truck." The driver studied me for a moment, then shrugged and started disconnecting the chains. "Not worth the hassle, man. I will call the HOA and tell them you refused." "Please do," I said. Barbara called me 5 minutes after the tow truck left, absolutely incoherent with rage. I could barely understand what she was saying, but the words lawsuit, criminal, and destroy you came through clearly. I let her rant for about 30 seconds, then calmly said, "Barbara, have a nice day," and hung up. Jennifer called me that afternoon, laughing. Apparently, Barbara had called her office screaming about me and threatening legal action. Jennifer had very professionally informed her that any lawsuit against me would be immediately countered with a much more substantial suit against Barbara personally and the HOA for harassment, breach of contract, discrimination, and about 6 other causes of action. Barbara had hung up on her. "She is losing it," Jennifer said. "I have seen this before with HOA presidents who have too much power for too long. They start to believe they are untouchable, and when someone finally stands up to them, they cannot handle it." "What do you think she will do next?" I asked. "Hard to say. She might escalate, or she might back down. Either way, keep documenting everything." Barbara escalated. 2 days later, I came home from a grocery run to find that someone had slashed all 4 tires on my truck. It was still parked across the access road, and all 4 tires were completely flat, cut with something sharp. I immediately called the sheriff's department and filed a report. A deputy came out, took photos, and wrote up the vandalism. I explained the ongoing dispute with the HOA and my suspicion about who might be responsible. "Can't accuse anyone without proof," the deputy said, "but I will include all this context in the report. You might want to set up a camera." I did exactly that. I ordered a wireless trail camera on Amazon with overnight shipping and installed it the next evening, carefully hidden in a tree with a view of my truck. The camera was motion activated and would send alerts to my phone. I also had to get my tires replaced, which cost me $700 and required having my truck towed to a shop and then driven back to the access road once it was fixed. I sent the bill to the HOA, noting that it was a result of vandalism that occurred on their property, and requested reimbursement. Barbara denied the request. The camera paid off 4 days later. At 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I pulled up the camera feed and watched as a figure approached my truck carrying something. Even in the infrared camera footage, I recognized the build and gait. It was Pete, the Plow driver. He walked up to my truck with what looked like a baseball bat and swung at the driver's side window. The glass shattered with a crash that I could hear from my house. He reached through the broken window, popped the hood, and then spent several minutes under the hood doing something I could not quite see from the camera angle. I was already on the phone with the sheriff's department, giving them a live update of what was happening. A deputy was dispatched immediately. Pete finished whatever he was doing and walked back toward the street just as the sheriff's SUV pulled up with lights flashing. The deputy caught him still carrying the bat, less than 100 feet from my vandalized truck. I walked out to give a statement and provide the video footage from my camera. The video clearly showed Pete breaking my window and tampering with my engine. The deputy arrested him on the spot for criminal mischief and vandalism. Pete, to my complete lack of surprise, immediately tried to claim that Barbara had told him to do it. He said she had been pressuring him for weeks to do something about my truck, and that she had specifically told him to disable it, so it could be towed as an inoperable vehicle. The deputy took detailed notes and informed Pete that implicating someone else in a crime was a serious matter and that he better be certain about his claims. Pete doubled down, saying he had text messages from Barbara to prove it. That changed things significantly. The next morning, a detective from the Boulder County Sheriff's Office called me to schedule an interview. I met with him that afternoon and provided all my documentation. The photos of snow discrimination, the emails, the videos, the timeline of events, everything. The detective, whose name was Detective Mark Ramsey, listened carefully and took copies of all my records. This started as a property dispute, but if the HOA president was directing criminal acts against you, that is conspiracy to commit vandalism at minimum, he said. We will need to interview her and examine those text messages Pete mentioned. Happy to cooperate however I can, I said. Detective Ramsey interviewed Barbara 2 days later. I was not present, obviously, but Jennifer had a contact in the sheriff's office who gave her a summary. Apparently, Barbara had denied everything, claimed Pete was lying to save himself, and insisted she had never encouraged anyone to vandalize my property. Then they showed her the text messages from her own phone. Pete had been smart enough to screenshot their entire conversation, and he turned it all over to the detective. The messages were damning. Barbara had sent dozens of texts over several weeks complaining about my truck, calling me various names, and increasingly suggesting that Pete needed to do something about the situation. The final messages, sent the day before Pete smashed my window, explicitly told him to make that truck disappear. And I don't care how you do it. That was enough for the district attorney to charge Barbara with conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and solicitation to commit vandalism. Both were misdemeanors under Colorado law, but they were still criminal charges that would require her to appear in court. The neighborhood erupted. An emergency HOA meeting was called, this time by Gary in his capacity as vice president, since Barbara had been asked to step aside from her duties while the criminal charges were pending. More than 50 residents showed up, filling the clubhouse to capacity. Gary explained the situation as diplomatically as possible, confirming that Barbara had been charged with crimes related to the ongoing dispute over snow removal, and that the board felt it was appropriate for her to temporarily relinquish her position as president. Barbara showed up anyway and tried to take control of the meeting. She stood up and started giving a speech about how she was innocent, how I had manufactured this entire situation, and how the other board members were traitors for not supporting her. The room was not having it. Multiple residents shouted her down, demanding she sit down and let Gary run the meeting. Frank stood up and gave an impassioned speech about how Barbara had been abusing her position for years, and how this was just the latest example. Tom talked about his own experiences with her vindictive enforcement of rules. One by one, other residents shared their stories. It was like a dam breaking. Years of frustration with Barbara's authoritarian management style came pouring out, and she sat there with her face bright red, unable to respond to the overwhelming tide of criticism. At the end of the meeting, Gary called for a vote of no confidence in Barbara's leadership. It was not technically binding since the board was elected, but it was a clear signal from the membership. The vote was 43 in favor of removing her, 6 against, and 3 abstentions. Barbara stormed out of the meeting, shouting that we would all regret this and that she would sue the HOA for defamation. No one seemed particularly worried. The next week, the board held another meeting to discuss immediate actions. With Barbara sidelined, the other 4 board members were suddenly much more reasonable. They voted unanimously to terminate the snow removal contract with Henderson Property Management, effective immediately, and to solicit bids from other contractors. They also voted to formally apologize to me for the discriminatory treatment I had received and to reimburse me for my tire replacement costs and my legal fees. I moved my truck from the access road that same day. The criminal case against Barbara moved forward slowly. Colorado courts were backlogged, and a misdemeanor vandalism conspiracy case was not high priority. Her lawyer negotiated with the district attorney for weeks, trying to get the charges reduced or dismissed, but the text messages were too clear. In late April, Barbara pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit criminal mischief in exchange for the other charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, a $500 fine, and 40 hours of community service. She also had to pay restitution for the damage to my truck, which came to about $1,200 including the window replacement and engine repairs. More importantly for the neighborhood, the conviction meant Barbara was no longer eligible to serve on the HOA board under a clause in the covenants that prohibited board members with criminal convictions. She was forced to resign officially, and a special election was held to replace her. Gary became the new president, and a retired schoolteacher named Helen was elected to fill the open board position. The new board immediately began implementing changes to make the HOA more transparent and accountable. They established clear procedures for handling complaints, created a resident ombudsman position to address disputes before they escalated, and revised the contractor bidding process to prevent the kind of nepotistic arrangements that Barbara had favored. The new snow removal contractor was a company called Mountain Peaks Landscaping, run by a professional crew that had no connection to anyone on the board. For the final few weeks of snow season, my driveway was plowed exactly the same as everyone else's. It was a beautiful thing. By May, when the snow finally stopped, the neighborhood felt different. People were friendlier, board meetings were civil, and there was a general sense that we had collectively thrown off an oppressive regime. It sounds dramatic, but anyone who has lived under a tyrannical HOA president understands exactly what I mean. I ran into Barbara once at the grocery store in June. She saw me from across the produce section and immediately turned and walked the other way. I felt no need to pursue any interaction. The situation was resolved. Justice had been served, and I was content to let her live her life while I lived mine. Frank retired from the board that summer, and at the annual meeting, he made a point of publicly thanking me for standing up to Barbara when no one else had the courage. It was embarrassing and gratifying in equal measure. Several other residents approached me over the following weeks to express similar sentiments. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons about HOAs, power dynamics, and the importance of documentation. If I had not kept meticulous records of every snow dump, every email, every interaction, I would never have been able to prove the discrimination was happening. The photos, timestamps, and detailed logs were essential to making my case both to the board and eventually to law enforcement. I also learned that standing up to bullies, even when it is uncomfortable and requires sustained effort, is worth it. It would have been easier to just accept the snow blocking and shovel every morning without complaint. It would have been simpler to not park my truck on the access road and avoid the conflict. But doing those things would have meant accepting unjust treatment, and it would have allowed Barbara to continue abusing her power against me and potentially future residents. My lawyer Jennifer told me later that she had seen dozens of HOA disputes over the years, but mine was one of the few where the resident actually won decisively. Most people give up because the fight is exhausting and expensive, and HOA boards have more resources and stamina for legal battles. The key difference in my case was that Barbara escalated to actual criminal behavior, which moved the dispute from civil HOA disagreement to criminal territory where the state had an interest in prosecuting. The truck parking strategy was also crucial. By finding a legal but disruptive way to impose consequences on the HOA for their behavior, I created leverage that I would not have otherwise had. I was not breaking any rules, but I was making their lives difficult in the same way they were making mine difficult. It forced them to actually address the underlying problem rather than just ignoring my complaints. Tom, the neighbor who had his own issues with Barbara, told me months later that my successful fight had inspired him to run for the board in the next election. He wanted to help ensure that the reforms Gary and Helen were implementing became permanent parts of how the HOA operated. I thought that was a great idea and told him he had my vote. The neighborhood continued to improve under the new board leadership. They renegotiated several vendor contracts and found savings that allowed them to reduce the monthly HOA fees by $15 per household. They organized more community events and actually listened to resident input. The monthly board meetings went from being sparsely attended sessions, where Barbara lectured everyone, to well-attended forums where genuine discussions happened. I stayed involved with the HOA, attending most meetings and serving on a couple of committees. I figured after everything that had happened, I had an obligation to help make sure the organization stayed healthy and functional. Plus, I had learned enough about the covenants and procedures that I could actually contribute meaningfully. One interesting footnote to the whole story: Pete, the Plow driver, ended up cooperating fully with the investigation and testified about Barbara's instructions to target my property. In exchange for his cooperation, his charges were reduced to a misdemeanor with a fine and probation. He apparently felt terrible about the whole thing and wrote me a letter of apology that his lawyer delivered. The letter explained that he had been afraid of losing the contract if he did not do what Barbara wanted, and that he deeply regretted letting himself be used to harass me. I appreciated the apology, though I did not respond directly. Some things are better left alone once they are resolved. Henderson Property Management, Barbara's brother-in-law's company, lost not just our HOA contract but several others in the area once word spread about the scandal. Turns out that getting involved in criminal schemes at the direction of an HOA president is bad for business. The company ended up folding entirely by the end of the summer, and the brother-in-law moved to Wyoming. I felt a little bad about that, since he was not directly involved in the harassment, but consequences have a way of spreading when you are doing business with corrupt people. The access road where I parked my truck got a new gravel surface in August as part of a general improvement project. The board also installed better lighting back there and put up some tasteful signs marking it as HOA property. Every time I drive past it, I think about those months when my truck sat across that narrow lane, an immovable object blocking an unstoppable tyrant. It still makes me smile. My garage has been perfectly clear every winter since. The new snow removal company does excellent work, treating every property with equal care. On mornings after heavy snow, I look out my window and see a neat, easily manageable amount of snow near my driveway, exactly the same as everyone else's, and I feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The whole saga from that first morning in December when I realized the snow blocking was deliberate to the final resolution in late spring took about 6 months of my life. 6 months of stress, frustration, early morning shoveling, legal consultations, and constant vigilance. But at the end of it, I had a functioning HOA, a criminal conviction against someone who abused their power, and a neighborhood that was genuinely better for everyone. I still live in Breckenridge Estates, and I plan to stay for the foreseeable future. My house is great, my neighbors are good people, and the HOA is now run by reasonable adults who understand that their job is to serve the community, not rule it. It took a lot of effort to get here, but it was worth every hour of shoveling, every dollar spent on legal fees, and every moment of conflict. Sometimes people ask me if I would do it all again, knowing how much work and stress it would involve. The answer is yes, without hesitation. Not just for myself, but for all the neighbors who had been quietly suffering under Barbara's vindictive leadership for years. Someone needed to stand up to her, and it happened to be me. The timing worked out too. If this had happened in summer with no snow, I would not have had the leverage of the access road parking. If Barbara had been slightly smarter and had not left a text message trail, the criminal charges might not have stuck. If the other board members had not finally found their spines and voted against her, the reforms might not have happened. A lot of things had to align for the outcome to work out the way it did, but they did align, and justice prevailed. That does not always happen in HOA disputes or in life generally, so I consider myself fortunate. I also consider myself vindicated in my decision not to just accept the snow blocking and move on. Standing up for yourself, even in relatively small matters like snow removal, matters. It sets a precedent that you will not be pushed around, and it creates space for others to stand up as well. Frank told me once, during a conversation we had over beers in his backyard, that he wished he had been the one to confront Barbara years ago. He said he had watched her bully people and abuse her power for so long that he had become numb to it, accepting it as just how things were. Seeing me fight back reminded him that things did not have to be that way, and he regretted not being braver himself. I told him that everyone has their moment, and that he had supported me when I needed it, which took its own kind of courage. He had been one of the first to speak up at that board meeting, validating my complaints when Barbara was trying to dismiss them. That mattered a great deal. The experience also deepened my appreciation for good documentation and preparation. I am naturally organized and detail-oriented, which helped me keep all those photos and logs, but I became almost obsessive about it during the dispute. Every interaction with Barbara got documented. Every snow dump got photographed from multiple angles with timestamps. Every email got saved and backed up. That documentation was my armor against false accusations and gaslighting, and it proved absolutely essential when things escalated to legal proceedings. If I could give advice to anyone facing a similar situation with an HOA or any other organization that wields power over them, it would be this. Document everything, know your rights, find good legal counsel, and do not be afraid to stand your ground when you are in the right. Also, look for creative leverage points. The access road parking was the key to my entire strategy because it gave me something concrete to trade for a resolution. I also learned that most people in positions of power in organizations like HOAs are reasonable and well-meaning. But occasionally, you get someone like Barbara who views the position as a personal fiefdom and uses it to settle scores and dominate others. Those people need to be checked and removed from power for the good of everyone involved. The criminal charges were crucial because they created consequences beyond just the HOA's internal politics. Barbara could ignore resident complaints and control board votes, but she could not ignore the criminal justice system. Once the sheriff's department got involved, her ability to manipulate the situation evaporated. I think about Pete sometimes and his decision to vandalize my truck at Barbara's urging. He destroyed his own reputation and business relationships because he was afraid to say no to an overbearing client. It is a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining your integrity even when under pressure. He could have simply refused Barbara's increasingly unhinged requests and probably would have kept his contract with a different board. Instead, he committed crimes on her behalf and lost everything. As for Barbara herself, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband put their house up for sale in September. They moved to Arizona before the end of the year. I do not know if it was because of the criminal conviction, the embarrassment of being ousted from the board, or just a desire for a fresh start somewhere else. Either way, I wish them well in my own mind. I have no personal animosity toward Barbara, despite everything she put me through. She let power corrupt her judgment, paid a price for it, and hopefully learned something from the experience. The new residents who bought Barbara's house are a nice young family with 2 kids. They have been great neighbors, and they got a kick out of hearing the story about the previous owner once they had lived there a few months. The husband joked that he would make sure to stay on my good side and never mess with my driveway. Helen, the new board member who replaced Barbara, brought a completely different energy to the HOA. She had been an elementary school principal for 30 years and had a natural gift for managing conflicts and keeping meetings productive. Under her influence and Gary's steady leadership, the board became a functional governing body rather than Barbara's personal tool. They implemented term limits for board positions, so no one could serve as president for more than 3 consecutive 2-year terms. It was a direct response to Barbara's decade-long reign, and it passed with overwhelming support from the membership. They also created clearer processes for resident complaints, with mandatory written responses within 30 days and an appeals process if residents were unsatisfied. The changes made Breckenridge Estates a genuinely pleasant place to live. Property values in the neighborhood increased slightly faster than comparable areas, which real estate agents attributed to the improved HOA management. People wanted to live in a community that was well-run and fair. I ended up serving on the board myself for a 2-year term starting in the 2nd year after the Barbara situation resolved. I ran for the treasurer position and won easily, probably because residents remembered how I had stood up to corruption and figured I would be careful with their money. It was interesting being on the other side of the table, making decisions instead of just complaining about them. During my time on the board, we successfully negotiated better contracts for landscaping, repaired the community pool, and set up a reserve fund for long-term capital improvements. We also dealt with our share of resident complaints, which gave me empathy for how difficult it can be to balance competing interests and limited resources. The key difference from Barbara's approach was that we treated everyone fairly and actually listened to concerns rather than dismissing them. One of my prouder moments on the board was when we had to deal with a situation where a resident was violating the covenants by running a commercial auto repair business from his garage. It was clearly against the rules and was creating noise and traffic problems for his neighbors. But instead of just hitting him with fines and threats like Barbara would have done, we met with him to understand his situation. Turns out he had lost his job and was trying to make ends meet. We gave him 60 days to wind down the business and connected him with resources to find a proper commercial space and legitimate employment. He appreciated being treated with respect and complied fully. That was the philosophy of the new board. Firm but fair, enforcing the rules while treating residents as human beings with circumstances and challenges. It was not complicated, but it required genuine good faith and a desire to serve the community rather than dominate it. My 2 years on the board came and went, and I chose not to run for a second term. I had contributed what I wanted to contribute and felt it was time for fresh perspectives. A retired accountant named Bill took over as treasurer and did an excellent job. I stayed involved as a regular meeting attendee and occasional volunteer, but I was happy to step back from the formal leadership role. The access road where I had parked my truck became something of a neighborhood legend. New residents would hear the story and ask to see the exact spot where the great HOA standoff of 2025 had taken place. It became a symbol of resident empowerment and a reminder that even the most established authority can be challenged when it abuses its power. Every winter when the snow starts falling, I take a moment to appreciate how far we have come as a community. My driveway gets plowed cleanly and fairly. The HOA operates transparently. Board meetings are productive rather than exercises in humiliation. And residents feel empowered to speak up when something is wrong, knowing they will be heard rather than punished. That is what I fought for during those cold months when I woke up every morning to a blocked garage and spent my evenings moving my truck back to the access road. Not just fair snow removal for myself, but a better community for everyone. The personal vindication was satisfying, but the systemic change was the real victory. Looking back on it all now, the whole experience feels almost surreal. It started with something as simple as snow in the wrong place and escalated to criminal charges, neighborhood upheaval, and fundamental reform of how our community was governed. But that is how these things often work. Small injustices accumulate until someone finally says enough and takes action, and then everything changes. I am glad I was that someone. I am glad I took the photos, hired the lawyer, parked my truck, and refused to back down. I am glad the other board members found their courage and the neighbors spoke up, and the justice system worked the way it was supposed to. All of those pieces mattered. The story has become part of the neighborhood lore, told to new residents and referenced whenever someone on the board suggests doing something questionable. Remember what happened with Barbara, someone will say, and the message is clear. We will not tolerate abuse of power or unfair treatment of residents. My truck, the same F-250 that served as both victim of vandalism and instrument of resistance, is still going strong. I kept it after all that happened, even though I could have replaced it. It has new tires, a new window, and whatever engine repairs were necessary after Pete's sabotage, but it is the same vehicle that blocked the access road through that long winter. Every time I drive it, I remember those months of cold mornings and hot conflict, and I feel a quiet pride in what we accomplished. The final chapter in the saga came about 18 months after everything was resolved. I received a letter from Barbara's lawyer with a check for $1,200, the full restitution amount she owed for the damage to my truck. The letter included no personal message, just the payment as ordered by the court. I deposited the check and used the money to buy a new snow blower for myself and to make a donation to a local charity that helped families with home repairs. It felt right to use Barbara's restitution payment to do something positive. Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 winters after all this happened. He was 83 and had lived a good life. At his funeral, his daughter mentioned that her father had talked frequently about the HOA situation and how proud he was that someone had finally stood up to Barbara. She said watching me fight that battle had given him hope that regular people could still make a difference. I was honored that he felt that way and glad I had made his final years in the neighborhood more peaceful. The neighborhood planted a tree in Frank's memory in the common area near the clubhouse. It is a Colorado blue spruce, native to our state and hardy enough to withstand the tough winters. Every time I see it, I think about Frank and his quiet support during those difficult months. Life in Breckenridge Estates settled into a pleasant routine. Seasons changed, snow came and went, and the HOA functioned as it was supposed to. My garage remained clear every winter morning, which never stopped feeling like a small miracle after that first terrible winter of targeted snow dumps. I made peace with the whole experience and integrated it into my understanding of how the world works. Power corrupts, but it can be checked. Bullies can be stopped. Systems can be reformed. Documentation matters. Community matters. Standing up matters. These were not new lessons, but learning them through direct experience made them visceral and permanent. I carry them with me now in all aspects of my life, more willing to speak up when I see injustice and more confident that doing so can make a real difference. The story ends where it began, with snow, a driveway, and a homeowners association, but everything is different now. The snow gets plowed fairly. The driveway stays clear, and the homeowners association serves its members rather than ruling them. That is how it always should have been, and now that is how it is. I still live at the same address in Breckenridge Estates. I still work from home as a software engineer. I still drive the same truck. But I am different now, shaped by those months of conflict and resolution into someone more aware of my rights, more willing to defend them, and more conscious of the importance of fair and accountable governance in all areas of life. If I had to sum up the entire experience in a single thought, it would be this: never underestimate the power of one person standing up for what is right. It took just one resident refusing to accept unfair treatment to expose years of corruption, remove an abusive board president, reform an entire HOA, and create a better community for dozens of families. That is a pretty good return on investment for a winter spent shoveling snow and strategically parking a truck. The story of how the HOA plow blocked my garage every morning and how I parked across their access road all winter in response is ultimately a story about justice, persistence, and community. It is about refusing to accept injustice even when it would be easier to do so. It is about finding leverage when you are up against more powerful opponents, and it is about the possibility of real change when ordinary people decide they have had enough and take action. That is my story. That is what happened when I decided to fight back against an abusive homeowners association in Boulder County, Colorado. It was exhausting, stressful, and at times infuriating. It was also necessary, righteous, and ultimately successful. I would do it all again in a heartbeat, and I hope my experience inspires others facing similar situations to stand up for themselves as well. Because when we do, when we refuse to be bullied and demand fair treatment, we make the world a little bit better for everyone.